Hey, Will Allen.
Dr. UFO.
How are we doing? Our next speaker, of course, is our favorite man from Washington, D.C., Will Allen. And he's our representative. He's better than Obama.
Oh, don't say that.
He's doing a hell of a lot more than Obama.
Yes, we can.
No, we can't. No, we can't. 4 years later, we're still in the same problem. Okay, Will Allen, new UFOs over Washington, D.C. It's a real treat. Never before seen photographs of UFOs which Will had the good fortune to capture. Welcome aboard again.
Thank you, and thank you for having me again.
Yes. All right, well,
let me start this off a little differently. First, let's dim the lights considerably so I can go through this really quick. My presentation is not about Washington, D.C.
Okay.
It is about Area 51.
Oh, it's not okay.
And I was at Area 51 3 days ago with a crew.
With Discovery Channel.
Well, we'll just say a crew. And we went out to location, which was the main road for the main gate to Area 51, and we were intimidated by the security personnel at Area 51.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because I had this really strange feeling that we were being watched, and it wasn't necessarily the type of feeling that you would get being watched from humans. But as we progressed into Area 51, and I brought along with me extremely advanced camera technology, and this is a sample taken by the camera, which is showing an area in Washington taken at night under 50,000 ISO conditions.
Wow.
So we just to establish the type of photography this camera can generate. So in going to Area 51, and there's the main box, and it says UFODC.com was here. And I was there. We set out to go to the main gate and set up to do a shoot based on just being in that area. And as I set up my cameras, and first I'm going to show you some samples that I got from a remote camera that was set in the middle of the desert. And I set my camera to fire an image every 10 seconds. And I fired off 500 shots in a course of about 3 hours. And when I went back to retrieve my camera, I found lots of beautiful star fields, but I found this one particular image. And I can't explain how. For example, I have this squiggly impression, especially when we understand that the conditions of the shoot were that each exposure was essentially a 2-second exposure. So for the 2-second exposure, whatever this object was would have to fly into the frame to field of vision and generate this impression in less than 2 seconds. And we could see that based on the photographic sample that whatever this object was pulsing. But what's interesting, it entered into the field of view at the very top of the frame. It started here and went around, went all the way around and stopped here, looped back around, and went back into outer space in less than 2 seconds. In less than 2 seconds. So that was the first thing that I thought was very abstract, because where I set my camera for this remote shoot, which I call the drop camera, there was no light. And in the desert, especially at night, basically what we got here was a star field which showed all of the stars that the human eye could not see, and nebula matter, which the human eye could not see also, but it was also registered in the exposure itself. But I'm going to continue and go down, because this was the first day of the shoot. And I started getting really, really interesting photographs. This photograph here shows an area which was basically the front of Area 51. And in the photograph itself, which is a no-fly zone, was an object which flew from here behind this mountain and then vanishes. It doesn't come back out, because when I set the camera up to fire each frame in 10-second intervals, it showed that in this sequence of images that there was airborne activity in Area 51, which was not supposed to happen because it's a restricted airspace. And secondly, it showed this object fly behind this mountain and completely vanish. That blew me away totally right there, because initially, based on what I was told, it is a no-fly zone. So I continued, and again, here's a sample. There's an object there. Now wait a minute, this is a no-fly zone, but yet in this particular set of images, whatever that object was flew behind that first mountain and never came back out. So that set off a few flags. Then we went to the front road of Area 51, and I fired off 5 consecutive shots from my camera, and each frame is essentially the same except for this object, which was slithering. And I found out that there were 2 objects up there as we continued to do the research there, and at that point I noticed that I was getting this signal. Something was telling me, you need to leave right now, pull your camera up and go. And I did, and in firing these 5 shots, I got this sequence of images which showed whatever this object was slithering through space. But we went back to our area where the crew was, all the buses were based on the crew, where all the buses went when the crew finished the shoot. And well, actually, before we went there, this is one of the samples from that sequence of shots. But I had to show that, and based on what I was told from some of my friends in the media, that a lot of people would think that I generated these samples with CGI technology. And one of the things you have to note, CGI technology does not incorporate metadata into an image. Metadata is generally something that's embedded in the image profile from a camera. And generally speaking, the camera gives you the data like the shutter speed, the aperture, time of the photograph, etc. So you have metadata associated with it, and I had to show the metadata impressions of the photographs that I took to prove that these samples were not generated by a CGI program like Maya or 3D Max. And I went into further, and it showed the conditions of the shoot based on the camera technology, which is a D4 Nikon 180mm lens, single frames, and it gives all the specifics of the exposure, which is ISO set at 12,800 ISO. So I generated that technical data to show that these samples were not fictitiously generated, which a lot of people want to say, okay, this picture's not showing anything, but it could be generated with a computer. So I went beyond that. Here's the actual sample itself, and it shows the single object. What I did, because this camera is set up on a tripod, each frame can be lined up. It's called a composite. So I lined up all 5 frames and showed a composite of the object as it moved through space during the time that I was taking this photograph, which was on the main road to Area 51. I'm going to go further. There were 2 objects in the sky. One object was flying, going to left, or east to west, and the other object was entering into the airspace from the right corner of the actual exposure itself. And I did a composite with all of the 5 frames, and you could see that as the object appeared, this is the first frame, this is the first frame, this is the second frame, there's the third frame, there's the fourth frame, and the 5th frame. So we were able to ascertain that these objects were essentially flying in this kind of trajectory. So after I took these photographs and the security personnel from Area 51 chased us away from the area, we went back to the staging grounds. And one of the things I had to point out to my associates was, I took this photograph here on August the 3rd, 2008, and this was taken in Baltimore, and it shows this object in the sky zigzagging as it was leaving the area. The objects in Area 51 were zigzagging, slithering like snakes. They had the overall same flight characteristics as this object I photographed in 2008. So after I took the photographs from the main gate of Area 51, we went back to the staging area, which was in Rachel, Nevada. And Rachel, Nevada is also a no-fly zone. And in the samples taken from this POV was this object. And it was zigzagging, coming towards us. And my opinion was, whatever that object was the same object that I photographed 15 minutes earlier from the main gate of Area 51. And I believe that this object followed us back. So I took several shots from the POV, which is point of view of where the staging ground was at Area 51. And in the first sample, it showed a sequence of 4 spheres. In the very next sample, which was the very next frame, which was taken essentially one right after the other. This is the second frame right here, and you can see the object over the bus over there. In the second frame, we now see that these 4 spheres are now 3 spheres, and they're shaped like a C, which indicated it was turning. And in the third frame, which was even more interesting, was that it went from 4 spheres to 3 spheres to 1 sphere. And from that point on, we knew automatically that whatever this object was, it was definitely out there following us. So I did a composite of the 3 frames that were taken from that POV, and you could clearly see that whatever this object was had trajectory associated to it. So that indicated to me that the objects I photographed 15 minutes earlier and this object, based on its flight characteristics, were the same. So in my opinion, based on what I experienced at Area 51, that there is extraterrestrial technology in the air in Area 51 right now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
Well, even more interesting was the young lady. Where did she go? Carolyn, was that her name?
Carolyn.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, some of the samples that she was presenting just so happened to be the type of samples that I photographed back in the year 2002. And I'm going to go to a sample that was taken in 2008. And it shows these orange spheres, which landed in front of me, along with 18 other people in Baltimore, Maryland. So just bear with me here. I got to go through my website really quick since
Oh, you
I
mean
erased my photographs for Karen.
Allison Krauss.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I'm going to go to this chapter right here, which shows these orange spheres which landed in front of me in Baltimore. And this is the same as the sample that was mentioned by Allison, is that her name? In Pittsburgh, I believe, or in the woods somewhere in Pennsylvania. But here we have 2 physical samples. The top sample is taken by photographer Melvin Harris, who was here last conference that we had. And Melvin's sample showed this orange sphere, along with a smaller white sphere which was trailing it, flying through the air at Mount Vernon, New York. And this is July the 4th, 2008. Well, August the 3rd, 2008, which was exactly 30 days later, I took this photograph of these objects. And I say objects because if you look closely, you can see around this orange sphere are cloaked objects.
Yeah, I see my arms above it.
And they're in a formation around this sphere. And the sphere just happened to land in front of me and 18 people. I have these samples. When I call the 18 people I was with, they can't remember. They don't remember a thing from that night.
Wow.
It's very strange. Even more abstract was what I think to be the mothership that was photographed that night. And here's an article which was supposedly 1965 and 1966. And this is in Washington, D.C., overlooking the George Washington Parkway. And over the Potomac River, people saw what was an orange sphere traveling up the bank of the river. So we have some consistency here in whatever these objects were. I also was able to find orange spheres flying around in DC, but these orange spheres just seem to have translucent qualities associated to them. So I looked closely, and regardless to whatever I did to the orange sphere itself, it always yielded the same results as the objects I photographed in Baltimore. So going even further, we have additional samples showing these spheres in various locations, like this one here in the bottom, which was taken in Long Island in 2010, and other samples that were taken in England, Dorset Echo in England. This is a series of spheres, which you can't just Photoshop something like that. And here's Melvin's sample again, and here's my sample again. Here's a sample of an object which was similar to what Keith showed as the gentleman was fishing. And whatever this is taken at 1/8,000th of a second, and you notice there's a blur associated to it. So that indicates that whatever this object is, it's moving faster than the shutter speed used to capture this. It's moving much faster than 1/8,000th of a second. And you clearly see that there was something there. And when the objects landed in the trees in front of me, there was a blue object and an orange object, and the blue object landed first. The orange object was already in the trees, except it was lower towards ground level. And as I started photographing, I noticed in one of the samples was a streak. And that streak indicates that something flew by there extremely fast while this exposure was being taken. So we have other objects that were clearly there that night as I had this encounter with 18 people who all of a sudden can't remember what happened. So I continued to do my research on it, and I looked at the sphere itself and found that there were protrusions associated to the sphere. The protrusions were in the shape of a, what's the shape used for the Chrysler? What is that called? A
Pentagon?
in a pentagon shape. And you can see the protrusions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they're all spaced evenly. And I thought that was very unusual in the sense that whatever this object was, it did not have the characteristics of metal. It was not metal at all. It seemed to be more like plasma. And that's what Edgar Mitchell and I were discussing in our last meeting here. And Edgar had mentioned that the extraterrestrials were using plasma-based technology for spacecraft, and they were also using wormhole technology to get from one, I would say one part of Earth to another, or one part of their planet to Earth, or vice versa. But whatever these objects are doing, they're definitely using a technology that's more advanced than what we're currently using. Karen?
Are you going to show the new picture?
A lot of that stuff that I was going to show, I erased so I could facilitate your reading. I'm sorry. So, but I felt that was more important for me to help you out on that than to present the material that I have. But for those who are interested in looking at the samples that I got from Area 51, all you have to do is go to ufodc.com, go to my website. I'm going to be updating the samples. I'm going back to Area 51 on Thursday, so I'm going to continue the job there. And in fact, after we finish with Area 51, we're going to Sedona, and we're going to do a shoot there also. And from what I understand, that area is also a UFO hotspot. But I did share some information with Karen, and I showed Karen some samples that I took taken from Area 51, which I fired 500 shots, and it tracked an object. And I think the best person to describe what I took a picture of would be Karen, because she actually saw the samples before I erased them for you.
Yes. It was really, really neat. There was a, thank you. There was in the shots an actual spot.
Yeah.
It was a spot in the picture that was fuzzy, and I could see where it was distorted versus the rest of the picture. And the UFO, or object, whatever it was right out of it. So it looked like it was an actual wormhole, or, you know, some